I would err on the higher side of how many times you're getting out to people. In this environment, your mission is really important. It's really important to connect with people and engage them in this last part of the year.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. Our mission is to help you raise more money so you can make the world a better place. Today's topic, nonprofit fundraising at year end, 4 things to do. For most nonprofits, calendar year-end fundraising is a crucial part of their annual fund program. For some, CYE donations account for the majority of their fundraising dollars for the entire year. In today's podcast episode, we will review 4 of our favorite strategies to help our clients beat their annual fundraising goals. Let's meet our panel.
Hi, I'm Diana Gardner, and I am the Vice President of Client Development at IPM.
This is Samantha Timlick, and I am the Vice President of Client Services at IPM.
And this is Russ Vaniff. I am the Managing Director and Chief Strategist with IPM.
Thank you all for joining me today for what is the final episode of our podcast for 2020.
Woohoo!
Yeah, we've got lots of great content planned for 2021, but today we'll be talking about some of the best fundraising strategies that nonprofits can use to make sure they end the year as strongly as possible. Before we get to the recommendations, I'd like to set the stage by sharing some news that came out in October. It's from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project's second quarter fundraising report for 2020. Now, although Q1 giving was down this year from 2019, giving for the entire first half of 2020, so that's Q1 plus Q2, was actually up 7.5% compared to the first half of 2019. Gifts across all donation levels went up, but the under $250 segment grew the most by nearly 20%. So the good news is that donors seem to have responded pretty darn generously in the first 3 to 4 months of the pandemic. Now that said, we know that COVID-19 has caused revenue to be down for some nonprofits, especially membership-based organizations. Also, as the infection numbers continue to rise, we're already seeing a new round of shutdowns in hotspots across the country. No one knows how long this will last or how it will affect long-term giving trends. So my first question for the panel is, what are you seeing with our clients, and what does it mean for CYE fundraising?
Yeah, so the impact of COVID that we've seen with clients and what we're seeing in the industry, it really varies from nonprofit to nonprofit. It's clear that membership-based organizations, nonprofits that really rely on that experiential delivery to connect with their audiences have been hardest hit. But, COVID really, those people have found some ways to work around it. It's clear they're not operating at 100% in terms of revenue, but it has highlighted the need for a really strong case for support. So people who have a strong case for support, a strong value proposition, those are the organizations that are weathering this. But as we look at calendar year-end giving, I think it's important that maybe it's time to put your mission first, have your theme of your calendar year-end mailings, unless you're on the front lines in a healthcare organization or human services, if you're directly tied to COVID and you can authentically make that connection and tie it into a strong year-end message, go ahead and do that. I think for almost everybody else, it's an important time to highlight your case for support, make sure that's really strong, really airtight, and have a very strong donor value proposition, and maybe put COVID on the back burner. You can use COVID as color for that, and make sure that you're not completely ignoring it, but really focus on the work and get people focused on what you're doing out in the community.
So that leads us nicely into our first recommendation. Make sure you send an end of the year appeal. In other words, assume that your donors still want to support your mission even during this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll take this one, Curtis. I think, as people have been a little bit more reserved as to what do they do in terms of fundraising during a pandemic, starting to warm up to the concept that they should continue to, charge forward. And that, with no exception, means the calendar year end. Calendar year end is probably, for most organizations, the strongest quarter in which organizations receive the most funding, as it ties into year end giving and acknowledging new goals into the new year. It's also, particularly for some of my clients, when we discuss forecasting and projections, it's an excellent opportunity to make up for any lost revenue from the previous quarters. And it really allows the organization to readjust and realign themselves with what's a more realistic fundraising goal as you close out the calendar year. And having said that, it's a really great opportunity to tap into your arsenal of lapsed donors, folks who have not connected with you throughout the previous year. Really exciting opportunity to re-energize and bring them back to improve on some of those attrition rates, particularly for those who in some instances have marked their communication preferences to only being contacted once or even twice a year. This is the, kind of all-in campaign that you want to re-engage and reactivate that base.
I totally agree with everything Diana said there. And I'll just add that another group to think about at year end would be your monthly donors. It's a really great opportunity to acknowledge all of the support they've given you over the year and then ask them for an additional gift to close out the year, particularly if you are short of revenue or you have a specific goal that you're trying to reach. And the only other tip I will add here is we have a lot of discussions with clients about whether or not to include tax deductible when they're talking about giving in their general appeals. And, some do, some don't. It's a preference thing, but we have specifically tested it for CYE giving. And if you are only going to include that language on occasion, end of the year is the best time to include it. So whether it's in the PS or call out on the reply form, someplace where folks are sure to see it, I would encourage you to include that as well.
And just to add on to what Diana and Samantha were talking about, I think both of those takes are spot on. And, for most nonprofits, CYE represents anywhere from maybe a quarter to a half of their individual giving fundraising revenue for the year. So it's a super important time of year for basically every organization that's out there actively fundraising. This year, with Giving Tuesday falling at the beginning of December, it's kind of the de facto starting gun for CYE fundraising. And we're even doing fundraising, kind of counting down before Giving Tuesday. So there's a solid month, maybe even up to 6 weeks where you want to basically be in an active year-end campaign. And I think that this year, especially, anybody who's been kind of on the sidelines during COVID, and even people that gave early on when there was clearly a need that organizations were touting, I think you're going to have a great opportunity to get people who may have just been slow to respond in the earlier part of the year, but also it's a good opportunity to get people to give a second gift this year.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And speaking of gifts, this next recommendation is one of my favorites because it can be so powerful. So number 2, get a matching donor.
Yeah, a matching donor is really great for the end of the year. We have seen an excellent response in this. We have A/B tested it as well. And appeals that include a matching donor often have a higher response rate than those that don't. So the end of the year is a great time to have a matching donor. And really, any match is better than no match. But the best match is one where you can get very specific. So you have a specific individual who's willing to put their name and their face on it. Ideally, if it's somebody who would be well known by your donors, that's even better. But simply being able to name the individual or entity who is giving, who is matching gifts, as opposed to saying, an anonymous donor, even, a board match can be very effective here. So I would encourage you to get as specific as possible in terms of being able to share who is doing the matching and what your goal is, and then always remembering to follow up on that goal to sort of close the loop with your donors.
And I think to add on to that, it's important to make sure that if you do present a match to donors and prospects, you tie it to a deadline. You want to use that match to generate a sense of urgency. And typically, There's lots of timelines you could look at. You could try it longer than 48 hours, but I think the best results that we see are matches that are delivered by email. Maybe you can reinforce them on social media. In large part, you don't want to make the match longer than maybe 48 hours when you're dealing with the online kind of digital platforms.
And I would echo both Samantha and Russ in saying that, we have some pretty specific experience running match campaigns with calendar year end for a couple of our clients, one in which was anonymous and another was named. And the named match outperformed the anonymous match by various donors. So we're talking not just the 0 to 12 month, but we were looking at even extended long lapse donors who came back as a result of a named match campaign versus a non-named match campaign. And I would also reiterate what Russ said is that we don't necessarily want to drag out the match opportunity because it sort of loses its essence of urgency. It really sweetens the deal when you run a quote unquote limited time or a limited offer that helps incentivize donors to give even more. And by running it for a limited time on various platforms, including on your website, and having it as somewhat of a pop-up or a window, as well as in the digital space, you can do social and retargeting campaigns. By putting that specific timeline really does give this sort of nice bump and trajectory in those closing days before the calendar year end deadline.
Interesting. So regarding this idea of urgency, we've all seen those email appeals that use a countdown, 1 week left, just 48 hours left to make your year-end donation, that kind of thing. Is that a good way to generate urgency?
Again, I think what we're looking for here is to generate an authentic sense of urgency. If you can have, number one, have appeal messaging that's goal-based, right? Don't just make it this general kind of black hole that people are throwing money into. Really set some goals, set some meaningful goals for your campaign, for your year-end campaign, and keep people updated on that. Maybe if you can, have a live update or a thermometer or some kind of regular update on how you're doing, at least daily, that's a good practice to do. That sense of urgency can come through in a lot of different ways. One way that we work with clients is to theme a series. So you'll have more than one email. You'll have multiple emails go out. Maybe you do it across multiple channels. You can integrate it with direct mail, social media, maybe even get your corporate communications side of the house involved with PR. Any way that you can kind of present this unified front of communications, that this is really, your last ditch kind of micro campaign for the end of the year. And the better constructed that campaign is in terms of just making sure that everything is working in lockstep. Look at it like gears just meshed together that are driving this. The better your results will be at the end of the year.
And I would agree with that. It's really beautiful to see when the various departments come together, even people outside of advancement and development, working together on a singular goal and having that sort of unified lockstep that Russ was talking about come at play, where everyone is singing the same song and dancing the same dance, because those are the efforts that are way more successful than the efforts that are a little bit more in a silo versus cohesion.
One of the things that we do see people do is, on Giving Tuesday, they might come out with something that's thematic, it's kind of catchy, it's well encapsulated, but then they just leave it for like 3 or 4 weeks and don't come back to it until the very end of the year. I think that's a missed opportunity for a lot of organizations. There's a lot of information coming to people right now. And so this sense of like, well, am I messaging too much? I would err on the higher side of how many times you're getting out to people. It's kind of this awful thing that we all have to be exposed to this kind of piling on of too much information and too many messages. But in this environment, your mission is really important. It's really important to connect with people and engage them in this last part of the year. And, when you spread out your messages and you kind of mix them in amongst all those other messages, it's not as thick as you think it is in terms of your own organization getting out there into people's attention spans.
I'd agree. And, I think this is something we've spoken about on other podcasts before, but we know that the two most important components of sort of moving the needle with your donors is strength and frequency of messaging. So you want to make sure that your message is strong and cohesive. You also want to make sure that you're getting out there and in front of people a lot, especially when it's such a busy environment right now.
Russ, you brought up this idea of goal-based messaging, which would ideally come from a nonprofit having clear internal goals in the first place. And that's a great setup for our next recommendation. Create a clear plan with specific goals for 2021. Now, Samantha, you and I recently had an interesting conversation. We were talking about different levels of goals for building a nonprofit's annual fund donor file. Could you maybe recap that for listeners as an example of what we mean when we say specific goals and why that's important?
You may have heard, if you listened to our first podcast about Is Annual Giving Dead, you know that I am a big fan of the annual fund. So I like to recommend that going into the new year, whether you're on a fiscal year or a calendar year, you really think big picture about what you're trying to do. And that goes beyond the annual fund. We're talking looking at your strategic plan, if you have one, identifying the big goals that you want to meet out of your fundraising plan. But if we're talking specifically about the annual fund, this is a really great opportunity to pull back and look at, for instance, the size of your donor file and set a goal or a threshold that you would like to meet. We know that if you are working with smaller file sizes, you are tending to pay more, specifically when it comes to direct mail, you pay more per piece. And it can be really tough to have a program net positive when you are finding yourself with a small file. You have to invest more in re-engaging those lapsed donors, and now you're paying more price per piece, and it can be really hard to get that program running at a net profit so it can do its job of feeding the pipeline of mid and major donors, but also do it in a sustained way where you're not paying more than you're bringing in to run it. So if you are looking at a file size that's less than 2,500, I would suggest that you consider doubling that. What would it take to get to 5,000? Because at that point, you're going to be saving more money in your production, and you're going to be setting yourself up for better prospecting. You can get into co-ops and more list exchanges so that you're bringing donors on at a lower price point. At 10,000 or 25,000 donor files, you're going to see a significant drop in your direct mail production. So if you're already at 5, maybe your next goal is 10, or maybe you're ready to look at what would it take to reach that 25,000 point. When you start getting into the higher figures, like 50,000 donors or 100,000 donors, and I'm talking active file that you are mailing consistently. So maybe not necessarily 0 to 24, but when you're getting into those higher levels of a donor file, you can generally afford to mail much more lapsed into your file at a lower cost, allowing you to reacquire lapsed donors at a cheaper rate than you would pay to bring on a brand new donor. So it's really, I guess my point here is going back to, this is the time to step back and look big picture at what you are trying to accomplish, and then put in place even the beginning steps to make that happen. Ideally you build it all the way out, but maybe you just need a baseline to get yourself rolling into the new year and get everybody on the same page with what you're trying to accomplish there.
And I would follow that up because, right, it's like you hear the saying, you make plans and God laughs. And the importance of that, it means that you must constantly adjust. The best laid plans are set out well in advance. But as you go along those plans, things tend to change. Budgets sort of change and communication strategies change. All that to say is the importance of meeting frequently with the various departments on what those plans are and what you need from them to be on board with your plans. Asking for help across the various departments, whether it's comms, operations, finance, really to focus on what the collaborative goal is. Because at the end of the day, as fundraising and development experts, it's your job to ensure that the lights are still on. And so it is so critical to be able to connect and check in frequently with those various departments to ensure that they're aligned with what your organizational goals are and how they can help.
And I'd like to speak to something Sam mentioned. When we talk to organizations about building their donor files. Some small organizations might only have 2,000 or 3,000 people on the file that are actively engaging with that nonprofit, and I think it's important for those smaller organizations and big organizations, for that matter, to think about the new annual giving. As we discussed in our white paper and in our previous podcast about whether annual giving is dead, donors aren't necessarily on a 12-month cycle, especially nowadays when everything is just so accelerated. So it's really important to think about annual giving kind of at two levels. The first is kind of your baseline level, where you're going to be running a consistent program. You're going to have maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 mailings a year, and you're going to reinforce those mailings across channels on email, and maybe do some targeted advertising to generate some prospects. But that's your baseline. You also want to set yourself up to leverage any episodic giving opportunities. And that's really, really important nowadays. Your organization might only get 1, maybe 2 chances a year to really leverage what's going on in current events, what's going on in the world, and convert interested people into your mission and convert them into supporters. You might only get them on board as warm prospects. You might be able to get someone to maybe sign a petition or somehow interact with your organization that isn't about giving money, but that's okay. It's okay to be generating warm prospects and building your internal list of prospects, so that when the time comes where everything aligns, where you can deliver them a really effective fundraising message, you're going to be much more likely to convert those people. Back in the day when we used to look at building an organization, it was all about, renting lists and getting people on board through direct mail prospecting. And, you're looking at really, really low levels of engagement on a lot of that. And that's still the case. It's still very difficult, very expensive to get people on board just out of the blue. It's akin to having people respond to a cold call. Basically, they might not know your work, they might not know your organization. But what you want to look for, again, you have your program just cruising along in your baseline fundraising, and then if you can look for those episodic giving opportunities, that's the way to really get a lot of people at once interested in your organization and convert them into supporters.
Just to piggyback on that, Russ, that brings up the very good point, which I also love to talk about, which is donor stewardship. So when you are investing your time and your money and your organization's resources and bringing on new donors, don't let it be a one and done transaction as much as possible. Once they are on, make sure you're communicating with them, you're providing value, and encouraging them to continue giving so that you can continue to realize the value that donor is bringing to your organization.
Hi, this is Curtis from IPM Advancement jumping in for a moment. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode. Moving on to our fourth and final recommendation. Revisit your donor value proposition, or if you're a membership-based organization, your member value proposition.
Yeah, so let's back it up even more to what drives people to give. So engagement in philanthropy really falls into two categories. You have intrinsic drivers and extrinsic drivers. So intrinsic drivers are kind of the touchy-feely, the warm fuzzies you get by supporting a cause you love. And they are generally kind of what everybody thinks of in ideal philanthropy, but they actually don't drive giving as much as you would think. It's much more likely that people are driven by extrinsic drivers. And those are things that we typically associate with like stewardship efforts, your case for support, and what we're talking about here, which is a donor or a member value proposition. And so, when you think about this donor member value proposition, you really want to put yourself in the shoes of the donor, take it from their point of view. It's a very donor-centric way of looking at the experience of engagement with your organization. And so you want to consider the case for support. Think about your donor promises. What are you promising that you're going to do with their contributions? What are they getting in return? Think about your donor benefits. Do your stewardship efforts really live up to the hype that you've kind of set yourself up for with these folks? And I would say that it's a good time, we're talking about CYE fundraising, calendar year end. It's a good time to kind of take stock of like, what is the experience that someone's going to have if they give to us before calendar year end? Go through step by step and figure out that donor journey so that you understand from their point of view some of that value that you're providing. And it's a great time to just go through that point by point and see where your weaknesses are. Are there areas where you can improve that experience for donors to maximize retention, to maximize donor loyalty and member loyalty? This is an extremely important time to do this. And just in general, it's so important to, as Samantha alluded to maximize donor retention because it's much, much cheaper to keep a donor than to get a brand new donor.
And I would like to piggyback on this and just take a breath here, right? Because out of all the advice that we're giving today with respect to calendar year end, this is probably, in my opinion, the most valuable. And the reason being is what has a tendency to happen with calendar year end giving is that, like Giving Tuesday, it's incredibly noisy and incredibly crowded. And what typically happens where some organizations make their biggest mistake is they start fundraising around, oh, it's the end of the year, give us money and, set us up for success in the new year. And these are all great platitudes, right? But the fact of the matter is they're receiving tons of donor fundraising communications. And so what is going to compel a donor to give to your cause needs to be unique. It needs to break through that clutter. And one way to do that is to really go back to, what do I get out of this? What is that donor value proposition? So that folks understand why they're motivated in the first place to support your organization. So out of everything that we leave you with today, this is number one. And it's not just good housekeeping for calendar year end, but it's good housekeeping for fundraising in general as you embark in your annual fund.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the other thing to keep in mind here is when you are revisiting your donor value proposition, be very careful to be able to bring it all together into a very simple statement that everyone at your organization can articulate, and ideally that your donor can articulate. So they should be able to receive your content and know, exactly what it is that they're giving to and why and how it's making a difference in a very clear and simple way.
Well, I think we've covered the 4 recommendations we wanted to make today, but before I let you all go, I'd like to ask you for some listener takeaways. So what's something that's come up today, or maybe hasn't come up yet, that you really want to make sure listeners take away from this episode?
So I'll go first on that. And I want to point people back to a blog post that I did right after the 2016 election. It's so the blog post was titled "Adopting a Prepper Mindset for Survival Inside Trump's America," and it's on our blog if you search for it, or you can just Google search IPM advancement and prepper, and it'll come up. And it's kind of the intro and the hook is kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. I had met someone at that time who invited me to join like a local prepper group. I live kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And so this person asked me to join this group, and I said, okay, I'll think about it. And I didn't tell him it really wasn't my thing. I like to be prepared, but I wouldn't consider myself a prepper. And then I started thinking about it, and I'm like, I do kind of have that mindset sometimes with a lot of things, and especially with fundraising. When you look at a fundraising program, it's actually a healthy thing to have that prepper mindset when you're thinking about your program. And, calendar year end fundraising is a good time to put that into use and to think about it as you're thinking about next year and what you're going to do differently. It's really important to just take some time to sit down with a blank piece of paper and just workshop it out. Just think of all the things that could happen and all the various scenarios, and think of them both from your organization's point of view, but also think of them from your donor's point of view. And I think it's really important to try to get ahead of those things. If you can, in your best effort possible, think through what might happen, think about what your responses to that would be, and plan for it. Put some strategies in place so that you can leverage those things as opportunities instead of having to respond to them as crises. And so that would be my takeaway for folks is to use this time, but also looking into 2021, use this time to plan your program. But remember that annual giving's changed. We want to keep a steady, consistent program that's kind of your baseline all year long. Keep that going, but think about episodic giving and how you might be able to leverage those opportunities for your particular organization next year.
Thank you, Russ. Diana.
Those are pretty great points, Russ. I would say, and I'd go back to what I said earlier, this is the takeaway. Think about what your donor proposition is. What's that donor value proposition? And be authentic in laying out that case for support. Donors can see right through the mishigas. So be very, very authentic, and find ways to remind them why they support your cause in the first place through content that's going to cut through the noise.
And remember that it's not too late. We talked a lot about planning and sort of how you can set yourself up for success here at the end of the year, but don't let great be the enemy of the good. So if you're short on time, money, resources, or possibly all three, it is time to ruthlessly prioritize your goals. Identify the opportunities for your organization that are going to give you the highest return based on what you can afford to invest, and start moving on them. And then you can start rolling into the lower priorities as you have time and resources and money. Make sure you keep everyone on the same page. Diana talked about that, getting all of your departments to talk to each other and your people to talk to each other so that you all know what you're working on and you can be pushing in the same direction. It is not great to be sailing the ship while you're building it, but it is better than never leaving the port. So go fundraise. It is not too late.
Yes, go fundraise. It's not too late. I love it. So that concludes our conversation on calendar year-end fundraising and our last podcast episode of 2020. Thanks to the panel for sharing their insights and expertise. And thank you, our listeners, who have made our first year of podcasting so successful. If there's any way we can help your fundraising, advocacy, or membership programs, please contact us at ipmadvancement.com. We also invite you to explore our free library of white papers, infographics, and blog articles in the Learn section of the IPM website. That address is ipmadvancement.com/learn. If you like this episode, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. And if you'd like to help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself, please leave us a review or share this episode with your network. Thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your year. Happy holidays to you and your loved ones, and we'll see you in 2021.